The footage you are looking at is not a dream, though it feels like a hallucination. A woman in a 19th century corset stands in a painted artificial garden. She reaches behind an oversized hand-painted cabbage and pulls out a living human infant. She sets it on the ground like a harvested vegetable, then reaches back and pulls out another. This is The Cabbage Fairy, filmed in 1896. It is the oldest surviving narrative film in existence. The director was Alice Guy-Blaché, a 22-year-old secretary who would become the most powerful woman in early cinema. But the question that history books rarely ask is, why? Why was the very first story cinema ever chose to tell about the harvesting of babies from a garden? To find the answer, we have to follow Alice Guy down the Boulevard des Capucines in Paris during that same spring of 1896. She stopped at a storefront she had never noticed before. Inside, the windows were lit, and against the walls were rows of glass and metal boxes. Inside those boxes were living human babies, premature infants, some small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. They were lying in machines modeled after chicken egg incubators because that is exactly what they were. The inventor, a French engineer named Alexandre Lyon, funded this entire medical operation by charging the public admission to come and watch newborns fight for their lives. 50,000 visitors paid to see these specimen babies in the first year alone. Alice Guy was one of them. Her own granddaughter confirmed decades later that Alice walked into that storefront, saw infants displayed in glass boxes for paying strangers, and 3 months later, she created the first narrative film in history. A fairy harvesting babies from a cabbage patch. The visual link is undeniable, but as this imagery began to spread, it wasn't just confined to the cinema. It began to flood the streets in the form of an Art Nouveau poster, showing babies sprouting from vines like botanical flowers. This wasn't just a quirky artistic choice. This visual language appeared in Paris before the postcards, before the dolls, and before the global phenomenon. It was an era where the concept of being born was being replaced by the concept of being grown. And while the elite of Paris were marveling at these babies in glass boxes, a much larger and darker movement was underway across the Atlantic. Between 1900 and 1920, hundreds of thousands of postcards began to flood Europe and North America, depicting babies being pulled from the earth like produce. They weren't produced by a single company. They came from dozens of independent studios across Germany, Russia, and the United States. We are told these were just whimsical birth announcements. But if that's true, why do so many of them show couples browsing through rows of babies like shoppers selecting fruit at a market? Why does the imagery look so commercial, so transactional? The answer involves a massive displacement of children that was happening in the background, a relocation so large that the culture needed a fairy tale to hide the truth of where these 250,000 children were actually coming from. The whimsy of the Cabbage Patch didn't stay on the silver screen. Between 1900 and 1920, hundreds of thousands of postcards began to flood Europe and North America. They depicted a bizarre, surreal world where babies were pulled from the earth like carrots, tended by gardeners with watering cans, and delivered to couples who browsed through rows of infants like shoppers selecting the best fruit at a stall. These were not the product of a single company or a coordinated marketing campaign. They emerged from dozens of independent studios across Germany, France, Russia, Spain, Britain, and the United States, all using the same specific, disturbing visual language. Art historians often dismiss these as sentimental birth announcements or harmless folklore. In France, parents had told children for centuries that boys came from cabbages and girls from roses. But if these were merely innocent announcements, why do so many of them show babies being sold? Why do they depict lotteries of children, or babies being won as prizes in a game of chance? The imagery is undeniably commercial and transactional. It shows human beings with no traceable parents, appearing from the soil, ready to be selected by anyone with the right price. This imagery was so pervasive and so unsettling that it caught the attention of the surrealists. Salvador Dali and André Breton collected these postcards obsessively. They didn't see them as charming, they saw them as a hallucination of popular modern thought. Dali claimed they contained a thought so sharp that it eluded psychoanalysis. The surrealists recognized that the culture was processing something it couldn't say out loud. They weren't looking at folklore. They were looking at a society that had normalized the idea of children as specimens, without history. But while the middle class was sending these cards through the mail, the largest mass displacement of children in American history was entering its most aggressive phase. Between 1854 and 1929, the Orphan Trains were moving up to 4,000 children per year. These children were lined up on railroad platforms in small Midwestern towns, where they were inspected by strangers who checked their teeth and felt their muscles as if they were livestock. These children had no birth certificates. They had no verified family histories. Most of them had been stripped of their original names. When a local community asked where all these parentless children were coming from, the culture didn't give a logistical answer. It gave a mythological one. The Cabbage Patch became the psychological cover story for 250,000 children who had been functionally harvested from the tenements of the East and replanted in the West. But the American chapter was only one part of a much older and more terrifying mechanism. Across the Atlantic, the system of anonymous abandonment had been refined over 8 centuries. It involved a rotating wooden cylinder built into the walls of churches and hospitals, a device designed to make sure a mother and child were separated forever without a single record of who they were. And as we look at the scale of this Foundling Wheel, we begin to see that the Cabbage Patch wasn't just a story for children. It was a necessary lie for a civilization that was abandoning its own at a rate the modern mind cannot fathom. The Cabbage Patch was more than a postcard. It was a psychological defense mechanism against a reality that had been building for 8 centuries. To understand why a civilization would suddenly start filming babies being pulled from the dirt, you have to look at the Foundling Wheel, or the rota. This was a rotating wooden cylinder built into the stone walls of churches and hospitals. A mother could place her infant inside, ring a bell, and walk away. The wheel would rotate, the child would be taken by staff on the other side, and the mother's identity remained a total secret. No names, no records, no questions. The first wheel was installed in Rome in 1198. By the 1800s, they had spread across the entire European continent like a network of anonymous drop boxes. The scale is staggering. In France, Italy, and Spain, as many as 1 in 3 babies born in major cities was deposited into these wheels. France alone had 251 Foundling Wheels at their peak, legalized by a decree on January 19, 1811. But the wheel was often a death sentence. Inside these founding hospitals, the mortality rate averaged 80%. In some years, it approached 100%. Of those who did survive were subjected to a total identity reset. In Italy, they were renamed Esposito, meaning exposed. In France, they were simply called the Found. They were children of the state, stripped of their bloodlines and repurposed. By the time the 1800s rolled around, Europe was literally overflowing with hundreds of thousands of children who had no parents. The Cabbage Patch folklore, the idea that children were found in gardens rather than born to mothers, was the only way a society could explain this. Massive, visible population of parentless infants to its own children. It was a narrative of erasure. It told the community, don't ask about the mother. The child was simply found. Now, hold that timeline. In 1863, France began closing its Foundling Wheels. But just as the stone wheels were being sealed in Europe, the technology of anonymous child keeping was taking a high-tech industrial turn. In 1889, a French engineer named Alexandre Lyon patented a baby incubator based on poultry equipment used for hatching chickens. He didn't put these machines in hospitals, he put them in storefronts on public boulevards. By 1896, these child hatcheries, or Kinderbrutenstalt, were the star attraction at the Berlin Exposition. Babies were no longer hidden behind church walls, they were displayed in glass boxes for 25 cents a ticket. And it was this exact display, babies as specimens in glass, that inspired the first narrative movie in history. But while Alice Guy was filming her Cabbage Fairy, a man was watching these exhibits with a much more commercial eye. He was about to take these anonymous infants and turn them into the most successful sideshow act in American history. But where was he getting a never-ending supply of premature babies that the medical world claimed didn't exist? While the stone wheels of the old world were being sealed, a new industrial method of child display was born. In 1896, at the Berlin Exposition, a display opened under a name that sounds like something out of a science fiction nightmare, Kinderbrutenstalt. Translated literally, it means the child hatchery. This wasn't a hospital ward, it was a pay-to-view exhibition. Premature infants were kept in rows of glass and metal boxes, heated by pipes, while thousands of fairgoers filed past to marvel at the specimens. Among the observers was a man named Martin Cooney. He claimed to be a doctor, though he likely never held a medical license in his life. He saw the hatchery and recognized a massive business opportunity. For 40 years, starting at the Omaha Trans-Mississippi Exposition and ending at Coney Island's Luna Park, Cooney ran a permanent incubator exhibit. He charged 25 cents for admission. He displayed tiny, anonymous infants next to sword swallowers, fire eaters, and bearded ladies. The medical establishment at the time was chillingly cold toward these children. Leading doctors called premature babies weaklings and defectives who were not worth the cost of saving. Some even advocated for a black stork policy, letting unfit infants die to protect the gene pool. In this environment, the only place a premature baby could survive was in a glass box at an amusement park. Cooney saved over 6,500 lives this way. His head nurse, Madame Recht, would slide a diamond ring up a baby's arm to the shoulder just to show the audience how small they were. But where was the supply coming from? If hospitals wouldn't treat them and mothers were supposedly abandoning them, how did Cooney maintain a constant rotating display of infants for 4 decades? The records are thin, the babies were anonymous, they were specimens from nowhere, being grown in a machine. This brings us back to the Cabbage Patch. The imagery of babies being pulled from a mechanical or garden-like void wasn't just folklore anymore, it was a physical reality being demonstrated daily on the boardwalk. By the time Cooney died in 1950, the incubator had finally been accepted into mainstream hospitals. The sideshows closed. The hatchery became the NICU. We are told the story ended there, that the whimsical postcards and the sideshow's babies were just a strange bridge to modern medicine. But 80 years after the postcards faded, the Cabbage Patch returned with a force that paralyzed the American retail market. In 1983, a toy was released that didn't just sell a doll, it sold the entire apparatus of the Foundling system, complete with legal adoption papers from a fake hospital. But there was a real woman behind that toy whose name was erased from history, much like the mothers of the Foundling Wheel. The Cabbage Patch mythology didn't die with the closing of the sideshows, it was simply hibernating. In 1983, it returned as a retail phenomenon that the modern world had never seen before. The Cabbage Patch Kids became the best-selling toy in history, generating over $2 billion in sales. But the branding was unsettlingly familiar to the history we've just uncovered. You didn't buy these dolls at a toy store, you adopted them from a place called Babyland General Hospital, a converted, abandoned medical clinic in Georgia. Every doll came with a unique name, a set of adoption papers, and a birth certificate. And just like the foundlings of the 19th century, these dolls had no parents. According to the official marketing mythology, a 10-year-old boy named Xavier Roberts followed a bunny bee behind a waterfall into a magical cabbage patch where babies were being born from the soil. It was the same Lilliputian hallucination that the Surrealists had collected 80 years prior, now repackaged for the children of the suburbs. But there was a real woman behind the magic who was being systematically erased. In the early 1970s, a Kentucky folk artist named Martha Nelson Thomas began creating doll babies. She didn't sell them. She adopted them out to friends and family, complete with handwritten birth certificates. Xavier Roberts saw her work at a craft fair, purchased several, and then began mass-producing a vinyl version under his own name. When Martha sued for the theft of her life's work, they settled out of court, and her name was legally scrubbed from the history of the product she invented. This is the pattern of the Foundling system. Compressed into a toy, a child appears from nowhere. The original creator's name is deleted, and the new owner receives a legal document certifying a fresh start. We are told this is just branding, a clever way to sell dolls to little girls. But why did grown adults physically fight each other in the aisles of department stores in 1983 just to get their hands on an adoption certificate for a piece of plastic? What primal memory was being triggered by the image of a parentless child born from a garden? Every culture needs a narrative to explain what it cannot say out loud. You do not tell a child their sibling was deposited in a wooden box in a church wall because the mother was starving. You tell them the baby was found in the Cabbage Patch. You do not tell a community that 250,000 children were stripped of their identities and shipped across a continent like cattle. You send postcards of babies growing in fairy gardens. The fairy tale does the work of erasure. It always has. Alice Guy-Blaché saw babies in glass boxes on a Paris boulevard and turned that trauma into the first story cinema ever told. That film, The Cabbage Fairy, is the foundational stone of our modern media. We started our narrative journey by trying to harvest life. Today, the original 1896 film is lost. 90% of all films made before 1929 are gone. The bridge to our past has been burned, but the Cabbage Patch remains. We have the postcards in museum archives. We have the Foundling Wheel still sitting in the walls of old hospitals. We have the Cabbage Patch Kids tucked away in attics across America. And we have a question that remains unanswered. What kind of civilization are we, if the longest-running cover story in our history is the one we use to explain where we came from? The archives are silent, the machines are off, but the cabbage garden is still waiting for the next harvest.